The night my son asked me to leave the house I had lived in for 40 years, I walked out without a word. He thought that was the end of it. He didn't know his father had spent the last 3 weeks of his life making sure it wasn't. The clock on the mantel read 11:42 when my son told me it was time to go. I had been sitting in the same armchair I had owned for nearly 2 decades, the one with the worn patch on the left armrest where Edward used to rest his hand while we watched the evening news together. The living room was quiet except for the low hum of the heating system and the distant sound of a car passing on Hargrove Street outside. It was the kind of quiet I had come to know well in the years since Edward passed. Familiar, steady, mine. My son Daniel, 41 years old, a man I had held in my arms the day he came into this world, stood in the center of that room with his hands clasped in front of him like he was about to deliver a presentation at his law firm. He was wearing the gray sweater I had given him 2 Christmases ago. I remember noticing that detail and thinking it was a strange thing to focus on, but the mind does what it must when the heart is not ready to catch up. Behind him, just far enough to seem uninvolved but close enough to make her presence felt, stood his wife. Sylvia had a particular talent for that, for occupying a room in a way that suggested she wasn't quite directing things, even when she clearly was. She was watching Daniel with an expression that managed to be both encouraging and impatient at the same time. I had spent 2 years learning to read that expression. By then, I knew it well. "Mom," Daniel began, and then stopped. He cleared his throat. "We've been talking, and we both think that it might be time for you to find somewhere more suitable. Somewhere designed for people in your situation. People in my situation." I was 69 years old. I had worked as a head nurse for 35 years. I had raised this man on my own after his father's first health scare, had held this household together through grief and uncertainty, and every quiet storm a family weathers over 4 decades. I was in excellent health, sharp of mind, and entirely capable of determining my own situation. Thank you very much. But I did not say any of that. I looked around the room instead. At the fireplace, Edward had repaired with his own hands the winter of 1987. At the bookshelves he had built from scratch in the garage and carried in one Saturday morning while I made coffee and pretended not to watch him struggling with the weight. At the faded photograph on the side table, the one taken on the front porch the summer Daniel turned 7, all of us squinting into the afternoon light, Edward's arm around my shoulder, Daniel holding a popsicle with both hands and grinning like the world had been made just for him. 40 years of living pressed into every corner of that room. 40 years of ordinary Tuesday evenings and Sunday morning breakfasts and arguments that ended in apologies and laughter and the particular tenderness that only comes from truly knowing another person. This was not just a house. This was the place where my life had happened. Sylvia shifted her weight slightly. A small movement. The kind that says, "We are waiting." "There's a very well-regarded community about 20 minutes from here," she said, stepping forward now that Daniel had gone quiet. Her voice was measured and smooth, the way it always was when she had rehearsed something. "Independent living. Very nice amenities. We already looked into it for you." She paused just long enough to let that settle. "We thought it would feel less overwhelming." "For you? Less overwhelming." I looked at the small suitcase near the front door. It was mine, one of the older ones from the hall closet, the dark one with the brass buckles that Edward had bought for a trip we took to Savannah for our anniversary. Someone had packed it. I had not packed it myself. I thought about asking who had done that. I decided it didn't matter. I stood up slowly, the way I had always stood with my back straight, the way my own mother had insisted on, the way I had insisted on with myself for 69 years. I smoothed the front of my cardigan. I looked at my son for a long moment at the man behind the presentation posture and the rehearsed words. The boy I had once stayed up all night with when he had a fever that wouldn't break. The child who used to fall asleep on my shoulder during long car rides and call out for me in the dark. He didn't meet my eyes. I walked to the coat rack by the front door. It was made of dark wood with 4 iron hooks, and Edward had installed it himself on a rainy November afternoon not long after we moved in. I had hung my coat on that rack so many times over the years that the motion was pure muscle memory by now. Reach, lift, slip into the sleeves, adjust the collar. I picked up the small suitcase with one hand. I opened the front door. The night air came in cool and sharp, carrying the scent of pine and the faint sweetness of the neighbors' late-blooming roses. Hargrove Street stretched out quiet and familiar in the darkness. the amber glow of the streetlights making long shadows on the pavement. A street I had walked for 40 years. A neighborhood that knew my name. I stepped outside. Neither Daniel nor Sylvia said anything as the door swung shut behind me. No last words, no hesitation, just the soft mechanical click of the latch catching, and then the silence of a Savannah night closing around me like a held breath. I stood on the porch for a moment, suitcase in hand, looking out at the street. In 35 years of nursing, I had stood in difficult rooms and delivered difficult news, and held the hands of people facing things no one should have to face. I had learned early that grace under pressure was not the absence of feeling, it was the decision to keep moving anyway, to stay upright, to breathe. I breathed. Then I walked down the front steps, crossed the porch, and started toward my car at the curb. I had not expected kindness, but I had not expected this either. I woke up in Carol's guest room just before 6 in the morning. The ceiling was low and painted a soft cream, nothing like the high ceilings I was used to, and for a moment, just a brief, disoriented moment, I didn't know where I was. Then I heard the familiar sound of a percolator running in the kitchen downstairs, and the particular creak of the third step on Carol's staircase, and I remembered everything. Carol Hutchins had been my closest friend for 31 years. We had met during my second year as a floor nurse at Savannah Memorial, back when we were both young enough to think we were invincible and tired enough to fall asleep standing up between shifts. She had retired 2 years before I did, moved into a tidy house on Oleander Drive with a vegetable garden she tended like it was a second career, and had always kept the guest room made up with fresh linens. Just in case, she used to say, though neither of us had ever specified, just in case of what. Apparently, this was what. I sat up slowly and looked at the small overnight bag on the chair in the corner, the one someone else had packed for me. I had not opened it yet. I was not quite ready to see what had been chosen, what had been left behind, what that selection said about how long whoever packed it expected me to be gone. I got up, put on the cardigan I had folded over the bedpost, and went downstairs. Carol was standing at the kitchen counter in her robe, pouring 2 mugs of coffee without being asked. That was the thing about old friendships. The good ones required very little explanation. She handed me a mug, pulled out a chair at the kitchen table, and sat down across from me. The morning light came through the window above the sink in long, pale lines, catching the steam rising from both our cups. She didn't ask me how I was. She knew better than that. Instead, she said, "Edward would have hated this." I wrapped both hands around the mug and looked out at her garden, where the early light was just beginning to reach the tops of the tomato stakes. She was right. Edward would have hated this more than almost anything. Edward Marsh had been, in the truest sense of the word, a builder. Not just in his profession, though. He had spent 30 years as a structural engineer and had known more about load-bearing walls and foundation depth than most people knew about anything but in the way he approached every single thing he cared about. He built slowly, deliberately, with an attention to what would last. He was not interested in shortcuts. He was not interested in appearances. He was interested in whether the thing he was making would still be standing in 20 years. He had been 32 years old when we bought the house on Hargrove Street, and I had been 30. It was the spring of 1985, and we had spent 3 weekends driving around Savannah looking at properties before he found the one he wanted. I remember standing in the empty living room on a Saturday afternoon while Edward walked the perimeter of every room, pressing his palms flat against the walls, testing the floors with his weight, crouching to look at the window frames from angles I would never have thought to consider. "Good bones," he had said finally, standing in the center of what would become our kitchen, looking up at the ceiling with the expression he reserved for things that met his standards. "This house has good bones." We moved in that September with a borrowed truck, a set of mismatched furniture, and absolutely no idea what we were doing. Daniel arrived 14 months later, a fact that Edward announced to everyone at his office by walking in on a Monday morning and telling his entire department, without preamble, that he was going to be somebody's father. Those early years on Hargrove Street were not easy, but they were full. Full in the way that matters, the kind of full that comes from a life being genuinely lived rather than merely managed. Edward worked long hours and coached Daniel's baseball team on weekends and fixed everything that broke himself rather than calling someone, not because we couldn't afford to call someone, but because he believed that a man should understand the things that sheltered his family. I worked my shifts at the hospital, studied for my certifications at the kitchen table after Daniel was asleep, and learned to read Edward's moods the way you learn to read weather by watching the small signs, the particular tilt of his shoulders, the way he held his coffee cup when something was on his mind. We argued sometimes, the way all couples do, about money in the lean years, about Daniel's schooling, about the stubborn leak in the upstairs bathroom that Edward kept insisting he could fix himself and couldn't, not for nearly 3 years. But we never went to bed angry. That had been Edward's rule, stated plainly on the night before our wedding and honored without exception for the entirety of our marriage. "I'm not always right," he had told me once, during one of those late-night conversations that only happen after 20 years with someone, when the defenses are down and the real things get said. "But I'm always here. That's the one promise I know I can keep." He kept it for 31 years. The heart attack came without warning on an otherwise unremarkable Tuesday in March, 8 years ago. He had been at his desk at the engineering firm he'd joined after retirement as a part-time consultant, still useful, still needed, still exactly where he wanted to be. The paramedics did everything right. The doctors did everything possible. None of it was enough. I got the call at 2:17 in the afternoon. I remember the exact time, because I had just looked at the clock in the hospital break room, thinking about whether I had enough time to eat something before my next round. The number on my phone was from a hospital on the other side of the city. I knew before I answered. The months that followed were the hardest of my life, harder than the lean years, harder than the sleepless nights with a newborn, harder than anything I had faced in 35 years of nursing, which was saying something. Grief is a strange and private country. No map works there. You find your way through it by moving forward one day at a time and refusing, on principle, to stop. I refused to stop. I kept the house. I kept my job until retirement came naturally 2 years later. I maintained the garden Edward had planted along the back fence, learned which of his tools did what. I painted the front porch myself one summer because it needed it, and because doing it myself felt like a conversation with him I wasn't ready to end. 8 years I had kept that house going. 8 years of quiet mornings and long evenings and the particular piece of a life that was entirely, unapologetically my own. Carol refilled my coffee without asking. Outside, the Savannah morning was warming up slowly, the way it does in early spring, gentle and unhurried, light moving across the garden in no particular rush. "What are you going to do?" Carol asked. I looked at her over the rim of my mug. "The same thing I always do," I said. The house was still standing, and so was I. There is a version of my son that I keep in a particular corner of my memory, the one I return to when I need to remind myself who he actually is, underneath everything that came later. In that version, he calls every Sunday evening at 7 o'clock. Not because I asked him to, not because it was written down anywhere or agreed upon in any formal way. It was simply something he had started doing in his late 20s, after he passed the bar exam and got his first real apartment and seemed to realize, the way some people do when they finally land on solid ground, that the people who helped them get there deserved a phone call. Those Sunday calls were never long, 20 minutes, maybe 30 if one of us had something on our mind. We talked about his cases, in the broad strokes he was allowed to share. We talked about the weather in Savannah versus wherever he happened to be traveling for work. We talked about the football season, which neither of us followed particularly closely, but which provided a reliable neutral topic when nothing else presented itself. Sometimes he called from his car, and I could hear the radio in the background, and he would narrate his drive to me like I was riding along with him. It was, in hindsight, one of the purest forms of love I have ever known, consistent, unprompted, and entirely unspectacular. Daniel had come into his own quietly, the way certain people do. He was not the kind of man who announced himself when he walked into a room. He had his father's steadiness and something of my stubbornness, which was a combination that served him reasonably well in a profession that required both patience and persistence. He had built a solid practice in corporate law, nothing flashy, nothing that made the evening news, but the kind of careful and reliable work that earns a reputation over time. His clients trusted him, his colleagues respected him. His mother was proud of him in the particular way that has nothing to do with achievement and everything to do with character. He was, in those years, a genuinely good man. He told me about her on a Sunday evening in early October, about 3 years ago. The leaves had just started turning along the streets near the house, and I was sitting on the back porch with a cup of tea when my phone rang a few minutes past 7. His voice had a different quality to it that evening, not nervous exactly, but careful. The way a person sounds when they have been thinking about how to say something and have decided to just say it. "I've been seeing someone," he said, "from work, sort of. She consults with the firm sometimes. Her name is Sylvia." I asked the things a mother asks. "How long? How did they meet? Is she kind to you?" He laughed a little at the last one. "Yeah, Mom, she's great." I noted that he answered the third question and let the first two drift past unanswered. But it was early days, and I told myself that detail didn't mean anything. I met her for the first time about 6 weeks later, at a dinner Daniel hosted at his apartment. She arrived composed and well-dressed and brought a bottle of wine she had clearly researched beforehand, not the kind of thing you grab on the way over, but the kind of thing you look up. She complimented the way Daniel had set the table, which he had done carefully and somewhat nervously, and she laughed at the right moments and asked me thoughtful questions about my years in nursing. She was, by every visible measure, impressive. I drove home that night, thinking she was exactly the sort of person Daniel had always needed alongside him, sharp and capable and present, in a way that suggested she paid attention to things. I went to bed feeling something close to relief. That was the last time I felt that way about Sylvia. The changes in Daniel were not dramatic. That was what made them difficult to name. At first, there was no single moment I could point to and say, "There, that was when something shifted." It was more like watching a tide go out, gradual, quiet. Noticeable only when you looked up and realized the shoreline had moved. The Sunday calls became less regular. 7 o'clock became 8, then sometimes 9, then occasional Sundays where the phone didn't ring at all and a text arrived the next morning instead, "Sorry, Mom." A crazy week, which I told myself was fine because it was fine, because adults have busy lives and relationships take time, and I was not the kind of mother who kept score. But I noticed he started canceling dinners more often. Not always, not dramatically, but with a new and particular pattern, always a plausible reason, always apologetic, always followed by a rescheduling that sometimes happened and sometimes didn't. When we did see each other, Sylvia was almost always present, which I had no objection to in principle. But there was a difference, I found, between a partner who joins a family and a partner who gradually repositions herself between a family's existing members, and I began to feel, slowly and without wanting to, that difference. The conversations changed too. They became shorter and more careful, as though Daniel were aware of an audience even when none was visible. He stopped telling me small things, the details of his week, the cases that frustrated him, the restaurants he had tried. The texture of his life, which I had known for 41 years, began to smooth over into something more polished and less real. I told myself this was normal, that this was what happened when a serious relationship entered the picture, that mothers across the country sat in their houses on Sunday evenings and made peace with exactly this kind of rearrangement and lived full and meaningful lives regardless. I told myself every mother goes through this. I almost believed it. Looking back, I can identify the exact moment the nature of things became clear to me. It was a Sunday afternoon in late November, about 18 months before the night I stood on my front porch with a suitcase. Daniel and Sylvia had come over for what had become our occasional Sunday dinner, the kind that happened every few weeks when schedules allowed and felt, on the surface, entirely normal. I had made a pot roast, Edward's recipe, the one I had memorized so completely over the years that I no longer needed to look it up. The table was set. The afternoon light was low and warm through the dining room windows. We were finishing the meal when Sylvia asked her first question. It came naturally, folded into the conversation the way she was skilled at doing, not as a question at all, really, but as an expression of concern. She had been talking about a colleague at the consulting firm whose elderly mother had recently passed without a proper estate plan in place, and what a difficult situation that had created for the family. "A real shame," she said. "So much unnecessary stress." "It just makes you think," she said, setting down her fork and looking at me with an expression of genuine-seeming thoughtfulness about making sure everything is in order, especially for people living alone. Brief Pause. "Do you have everything updated, Helen? The deed, the accounts, all of that?" It was, taken in isolation, an entirely reasonable question. I told her that everything was in order, thank you, and redirected the conversation towards something else. She let it go easily, which I noted. People who ask questions out of genuine concern tend to follow up. People who ask questions for other reasons tend to move on once they understand the answer isn't coming. Sylvia moved on, but she came back to it. Not that day, not the next visit, but gradually, the way a person returns to a subject they haven't finished with, each time from a slightly different angle, each time wrapped in a slightly different justification. There was the visit in December, when she mentioned, almost in passing, that she had been helping a friend navigate the process of updating property records after a parent's passing, and had learned a great deal about how complicated it could be when documents weren't current. "It's really worth doing while everything is straightforward," she said, "before there's any reason it needs to happen urgently." She looked at me with what I can only describe as performed concern, the expression arranged correctly, the tone calibrated precisely, but something behind the eyes that was doing a different calculation entirely. There was the afternoon in January when Daniel mentioned, in a way that felt slightly rehearsed, that Sylvia had some experience with estate documentation from her consulting work and would be happy to help me review anything that needed updating. No pressure, of course. Just an offer. I thanked him and said I would keep it in mind. There was the February visit when Sylvia asked. While I was showing her the renovation Edward had done to the back hallway, she had expressed admiration for the woodwork, which I had found faintly odd given that she had seen it before, whether the house had ever been appraised recently. "Property values in this neighborhood have gone up considerably," she said. "It might be worth knowing what you're sitting on." What you're sitting on? I filed that phrase away carefully. She had a technique, I came to understand, that relied on the appearance of helpfulness. Every question was framed as assistance. Every inquiry was presented as concern. She never asked anything that couldn't be explained away, as the natural interest of a daughter-in-law who cared about her husband's mother's well-being. But I had spent 35 years working in environments where people said one thing and meant another, where a patient's family member asked cheerful questions about discharge timelines that were really questions about something harder to say out loud, where administrators used the language of support to deliver decisions that were anything but supportive. I had learned over those decades to listen to the question underneath the question, to hear what wasn't being said as clearly as what was. What Sylvia was asking, underneath all of it, was simple. Whose name is on the paperwork, and what would it take to change that? She asked about the deed twice, on separate occasions, both times framed as practical concern. She asked about the accounts Edward had left, not directly, but through the approach of mentioning how important it was to consolidate finances after a spouse's passing, for simplicity's sake, and wasn't it something I had considered? She asked about whether I had a current will, which she noted with practiced casualness was something everyone should have updated regularly. She never once asked whether I was sleeping well. She never asked about my knees, which had been bothering me since the previous winter. She never asked about the book I had mentioned reading, or the volunteer shift I had picked up at the hospital, or whether I had heard from my cousin in Augusta. She asked about documents, about values, about names on paperwork. I answered her questions the way I had learned to answer difficult questions over a long career, honestly, minimally, and without offering anything that hadn't been directly requested. I gave her nothing she could use, and everything she needed to hear to believe she was making progress. Each time she asked, I kept my expression pleasant, and my voice even, and my hands relaxed on whatever surface they happened to be resting on. And each time she left, I sat quietly for a few minutes in the room after Daniel and Sylvia's car had pulled away from the curb, and I thought carefully about what I had just observed. I was not ready to act, not yet. I needed to be certain, not suspicious, not cautious, but genuinely certain before I did anything at all. That was the way Edward had always approached difficult situations, and it was the way I had always approached them too. You don't move until you know where you're standing. But I was watching. I had been watching for some time. There are questions a daughter-in-law asks out of care, and there are questions she asks out of calculation. Sylvia had never once asked the first kind. I waited 3 more weeks before I did anything. That was not hesitation, or at least, it was not only hesitation. It was the same instinct that had served me through 35 years of nursing. The understanding that acting too quickly on incomplete information was often worse than waiting. You assessed. You gathered. You made sure you understood what you were actually looking at before you decided what to do about it. By the middle of that 3rd week, I understood enough. I called Arthur Pendleton on a Thursday morning in early December. From the kitchen phone, standing at the counter the way I always did when I needed to think clearly. Arthur had been Edward's attorney before he was mine. They had gone to the same church for years, played in the same monthly card game, and developed the kind of friendship that forms between men of a certain generation who don't discuss their feelings directly but show up reliably for one another regardless. When Edward passed, Arthur had handled the estate with such quiet competence and genuine care that I had simply never considered using anyone else for anything legal that came up afterward. He was, in the truest sense, someone I trusted completely. He answered on the second ring, which was characteristic of him. "Helen," he said. And the warmth in that single word, the particular warmth of someone who has known you long enough to hear everything you haven't said yet, made something in my chest loosen slightly. I had not realized until that moment how much I had been carrying the weight of the previous months alone. "Arthur," I said, "I need to talk to you about something. Nothing urgent, but something." He told me to come in whenever was convenient, and when I arrived at his office the following afternoon, he was standing at the door of the building to meet me, which was not something attorneys generally did and was entirely something Arthur would do. His office was on the second floor of a building just off Bull Street in downtown Savannah, a quiet space with tall windows that looked out over a small courtyard, walls lined with the kind of books that had actually been read, and a pair of leather chairs across from his desk that had been there, as far as I could tell, since sometime in the previous century. He had a photograph of Edward and himself on the bookshelf behind his desk, taken at some function years ago, both of them in suits and laughing at something just outside the frame. I had seen that photograph many times. It never failed to do something to me. He poured 2 glasses of sweet tea without asking, and settled into his chair with the unhurried patience that was, I had always thought, his most valuable professional quality. Arthur Pendleton was a man who made you feel that whatever you had come to say was the most important thing he had to hear that day. In 30 years, I had never once felt rushed in his presence. I told him everything. Not dramatically, I was not given to drama, but thoroughly. I described the pattern of questions Sylvia had been asking over the preceding months. I described the specific inquiries about the deed, the accounts, the estate documents. I described the offer to help update my paperwork. I described the way each question had been carefully dressed in the language of concern. I told him about the phrase that had stayed with me, "what you're sitting on," and the particular quality of the silence that followed it. Arthur listened without interrupting. He had a way of listening that was different from most people's listening fully present, taking in not just the words but the pauses between them, the things that got said sideways. He held his glass of sweet tea in both hands and watched me speak, and when I finished, he was quiet for a moment in the way that meant he was thinking rather than preparing to respond. "How long has this been going on?" he asked. I told him approximately 8 months of consistent questioning, with the frequency increasing over the last 3. He nodded slowly. "And Daniel, does he seem aware of what she's asking?" I considered that. "He's made a couple of suggestions himself," I said, about updating documents, consolidating things, but they felt borrowed, like he was delivering a message rather than expressing his own concern. Arthur set his glass down carefully on the coaster beside his desk. "I want to pull the current documentation on the property and the estate," he said, "just to make sure everything is exactly where it should be. And I want to look at a few other things too, while I'm in there." I asked him what other things. He gave me the look he reserved for occasions when he knew more than he was ready to say. Not evasive, but careful. "Let me take a look first," he said. "I don't want to speculate until I know what I'm looking at." That was when I felt the first real shift in my understanding, not alarm, not yet, but the particular attention that comes when someone you trust responds to what you've said with more seriousness than you expected. I had come to Arthur thinking I was being cautious, perhaps overly so. The careful way he was now moving through his words suggested that caution might have been exactly the right response. We talked for another 20 minutes or so about the legal standing of various documents, about what the process of updating estate records typically involved, about nothing in particular as the afternoon light moved across the courtyard outside his window. He walked me back to the street when I left and shook my hand the way he always did, with both of his, which was an Edward habit I had never mentioned noticing. I drove home through the early December streets of Savannah, feeling, for the first time in months, that I was no longer entirely on my own with whatever this was. The house was quiet when I got back. I made a cup of tea and sat in the armchair in the sitting room, not the living room, a different chair, one I used for reading, and let the quiet settle around me. I did not know yet what Arthur would find. I did not know yet how large the thing I had stumbled into actually was. I only knew that I had taken a step, and that the step had been towards someone steady. Arthur said he would look into a few things. His voice was steady. I trusted that voice more than almost anything in the world. He called me back on a Wednesday morning, 10 days after my visit. I was in the garden when the phone rang, pulling up the last of the autumn growth along the back fence, the kind of quiet work that occupies the hands without requiring much of the mind. I had spent those 10 days doing what I always did when waiting for something important, keeping busy, staying practical, not allowing myself to speculate too far ahead of the available facts. I had weeded the garden, reorganized the linen closet, finished a book I had been meaning to read for months. I had not allowed myself to think too much about what Arthur might find. When I saw his name on the screen, I pulled off my garden gloves and answered immediately. His voice had a quality I recognized from the last time he had delivered serious news to me, measured and gentle, the way a person sounds when they are being careful with something fragile. "Helen," he said, "I need you to come in. There's something I have to show you in person." I went the following morning. The office felt different that day, or perhaps I felt different in it. The same tall windows, the same worn chairs, the same photograph on the shelf behind his desk. But the atmosphere had shifted in the way rooms sometimes do when they are about to contain something significant. Arthur was already standing when I came in, and he waited until I was seated before he sat down himself. On the desk between us was a manila folder, closed, with a small adhesive label on the front. I could see Edward's full name written on it in Arthur's careful handwriting. Below it, a date. I recognized the date immediately. It was 3 weeks before Edward passed. Arthur placed one hand briefly on top of the folder before he opened it. It was a small gesture, almost unconscious, and I understood it as the kind of thing a person does when they have been entrusted with something for a long time and are finally releasing it to the person it belongs to. "Edward came to see me," Arthur said, "about 3 weeks before he died." I folded my hands in my lap and waited. He had been thinking about it for some time. From what he told me, he didn't say he knew what was coming. I don't think he did. Not specifically. But Edward was always the kind of man who prepared for things he hoped would never happen. Arthur paused. He asked me to draw up a second will. The room was very quiet. The first will, the one that went through probate after he passed, left the estate divided, with certain provisions for Daniel and certain provisions for you. You know the terms of that document. Edward had signed it years earlier, and at the time it reflected his wishes accurately. Arthur opened the folder and turned it gently toward me. "This one is different." I looked down at the document. It was several pages, typed in the careful legal formatting I had seen on enough paperwork over the years to recognize it immediately. Edward's signature was at the bottom of the last page, his handwriting, unmistakably, in the particular slant I had read on birthday cards and grocery lists and the margins of books for 3 decades. Beside it, 2 witness signatures. And the stamp of a notary public, dated the same week as the label on the folder. "This will supersedes all previous documents," Arthur said. "It leaves the property on Hargrove Street, the remaining accounts, and all associated assets entirely to you. No division, no conditions. Everything to you, directly and completely." I did not say anything for a moment. "He had me keep the original," Arthur continued, "in the safe here. He was very specific about that. He didn't want it filed anywhere it could be easily found, and he didn't want you to know about it unless and until it became necessary." Arthur's voice remained steady, but there was something underneath it, the particular weight of a man who has kept a promise for 8 years and is now finally fulfilling the second half of it. "He said he hoped you would never need it, that if things went the way he expected them to, the first will would be sufficient, and this one would simply stay where it was until it wasn't relevant anymore." I looked at the signature again. Those letters, that particular pressure of pen on paper, I had loved that handwriting for more than 30 years. "Why didn't he tell me?" I asked. My voice was steady. I was proud of that. Arthur was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, it was slowly, as though he were reading from something written a long time ago that he had since memorized. He said, and I'm giving you his words as close to exactly as I can, that he didn't want you to carry the weight of it unless you had to, that you had enough to carry, that he wanted you to be able to love Daniel without a document between you for as long as that was possible. The afternoon light moved across the floor. I thought about Edward at 32, pressing his palms against walls to test their soundness. Edward coaching baseball in the summer heat because he believed in showing up. Edward staying up past midnight when Daniel was sick, sitting in the hallway outside the bedroom door because he couldn't fix it and couldn't leave. I thought about him 8 years ago, sitting in this same chair, signing his name to a document he hoped would never be needed, and then handing it to his oldest friend and asking him to keep it safe. Building something, for a storm he hoped would never come. I pressed my fingers briefly against the signature on the last page of the document just for a moment, just lightly, and then I sat back in the chair and let out a long, slow breath. "All right," I said. Arthur nodded. He understood that I needed a minute, and he gave it to me without comment, refilling the water glass on the desk and looking out the window at the courtyard below, with the tact of a man who has spent decades knowing when not to speak. When I was ready, I looked up. "What do we do now?" I asked. Arthur turned back from the window. The careful expression had settled into something steadier, purposeful, prepared. "Now," he said, "we make sure it's protected." He didn't want you to carry the weight of it unless you had to. 4 months passed between the morning Arthur showed me the second will and the afternoon he called to say he had found something else. In those 4 months, I had gone about my life with a particular kind of double awareness. On the surface, everything continued as it always had. The grocery runs, the volunteer shifts, the occasional Sunday dinners with Daniel and Sylvia that I attended with a steady face and a watchful mind. Underneath, the knowledge of the second will sat quietly, like a foundation I could feel beneath my feet even when I wasn't thinking about it directly. Arthur had advised me to say nothing and change nothing. He was looking into a few things. He wanted to be thorough. When he called that Wednesday afternoon, his voice carried the particular quality I had come to associate with news that required sitting down to receive. "Helen," he said, "I need you to come in again. And I want you to be prepared for this to be more complicated than we initially thought." The folder on his desk the next morning was considerably thicker than before, accompanied by a second set of documents flagged throughout with small colored markers. A yellow legal pad sat beside the stack with 2 columns of figures I could see from across the desk without yet being able to read. He waited until I was settled before he began. "After our last conversation," he said, "I pulled the complete financial records associated with Edward's estate. Everything that moved after probate closed every account, every transfer, every transaction that touched anything connected to his name." He paused. "What I found requires some explanation." He turned the first document toward me. A bank transfer record, dry and precise in its formatting. The date was 14 months after Edward had passed. "This transfer was authorized by a signature identified as Edward's," Arthur said. "The account it originated from was a secondary investment account that remained open after probate won with a separate beneficiary designation." He indicated a line near the bottom. "That designation was changed approximately 2 months before this transfer occurred." I looked at the signature on the authorization line. It looked like Edward's handwriting. The slant was right, the general shape familiar. But something sat wrong with me the way a piece of music sounds almost correct but carries a note that doesn't belong. "That's not his signature," I said. Arthur nodded. "That's what I suspected." I sent it, along with 3 other documents carrying similar authorizations, to a forensic document examiner, someone who analyzes handwriting, ink composition, and the physical characteristics of how a signature is actually made. He moved the legal pad forward. "The report came back last week." He handed me a bound document with side-by-side photographic comparisons of the questioned signatures against authenticated samples of Edward's handwriting from documents signed during his lifetime. Even to my untrained eye, the differences were visible once pointed out. The pressure was wrong, the terminal strokes were wrong. The spacing suggested someone who had studied the signature carefully but had never lived inside it the way Edward had for decades. "All 4 signatures are confirmed fraudulent," Arthur said. "The examiner's confidence level is high." The room went very quiet. "Where did the money go?" I asked. "That required a separate kind of expertise," he said, "which is why I brought in someone else." He glanced toward the door. "She's here, if you're ready." I told him I was. Rebecca Cho, a financial fraud investigator Arthur had worked with on several previous cases, carried herself with the precise, unhurried manner of someone accustomed to presenting difficult findings under pressure. She set her portfolio on the table and opened it without preamble. "Mrs. Marsh, she said, meeting my eyes directly. Some of what I'm about to show you will be difficult to hear. I want to walk you through it clearly before I explain what I believe it means. I told her to go ahead. She laid 4 sets of bank records side by side. Each corresponded to one of the fraudulent authorization documents. Each showed a transfer from an account connected to Edward's estate, different accounts, different amounts, spanning approximately 14 months into a single receiving account registered under a name I recognized immediately. The total across all 4 transfers was more than $300,000. I looked at the figures. I looked at the account name. I sat with that for what felt like a long time but was probably only a few seconds. I had spent 35 years delivering difficult information to families in waiting rooms and quiet offices. I knew the particular quality of the moment when hard news arrives, the brief suspension before the full weight settles into place. This was that moment. I looked at the name on the receiving account one more time. I thought about the questions asked over Sunday dinners, the careful language of concern wrapped around inquiries about deeds and accounts and what exactly I was sitting on. I thought about how long this had apparently been happening while I was attending those dinners with a steady face, passing the bread, asking about work. Rebecca Cho looked up from the documents. "This is significant," she said. She meant it in the professional sense, significant in terms of dollar amount, legal exposure, the case she was clearly already building. But I heard it another way entirely. The word landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water, and the ripples moved outward in every direction at once. When Rebecca Cho looked up from the documents and said, "This is significant," I understood the truth was worse than I had imagined. The hardest part was not knowing. The hardest part was knowing. I had spent my career in medicine, where uncertainty was an occupational condition, where you learned to function competently in the space between what you understood and what you were still waiting to confirm. I had always been reasonably good at that. I had always been able to hold difficult information at arm's length long enough to do what needed to be done. This was different. This was not uncertainty. This was certainty complete, documented, professionally confirmed certainty that someone had been reaching into the life Edward and I had built together and taking from it steadily and without shame while sitting at my table and asking me to pass the bread. Arthur called me 2 days after the meeting with Rebecca and asked me to be patient. They needed more time to build the full picture, more records, more documentation, enough to be unassailable rather than merely compelling. "We want this to be airtight," he said. "That means doing it right rather than doing it fast." I told him I understood. Then I hung up the phone and stood in my kitchen for a long time, looking at nothing in particular. The months that followed had a quality I can only describe as the performance of normalcy. Every surface of my daily life continued exactly as it always had: the morning walks, the volunteer shifts, the library books, the phone calls, the neighbor's dog that came to my fence every afternoon expecting a treat and received one without fail. From the outside, nothing had changed. From the inside, everything was different. The dinners with Daniel and Sylvia continued, because stopping them would have signaled something I wasn't ready to signal. I drove to those dinners with deliberate calm, the same way I had once driven to difficult shifts at the hospital, reminding myself that the situation required steadiness, that steadiness was a choice, that I had made harder choices than this, and come through them intact. Sitting across from Sylvia at the dinner table required a particular kind of effort I had not previously needed to make. She was exactly as she had always been: composed, attentive, her questions carefully framed, her expressions calibrated to the moment. Nothing about her outward presentation had changed. That was, in a way, the most difficult thing. There was no villain's mask to look at. There was only the same pleasant face I had been watching for 3 years, now understood entirely differently. I watched her pour wine and discuss her consulting work, and ask Daniel whether he wanted more of whatever was on the table, and I thought about the documents on Arthur's desk, and I kept my face exactly where I needed it to be. She presented me with paperwork twice during those months. The first time was in early autumn, a form she described as a routine update to the property insurance, requiring a signature from the homeowner of record. She produced it at the end of a dinner, setting it on the table beside my dessert plate with a pen already uncapped, in the practiced manner of someone who understood the value of timing. I picked it up. I read it with the thoroughness of someone who had spent decades reviewing medical documentation and understood that the thing presented for signature was not always the thing it claimed to be. It was not what she said it was. I set it down, smiled pleasantly, and told her I made it a policy never to sign anything without running it by Arthur first. Just a habit, I said. Nothing personal. The second time was in November, a different document, a different explanation, the same uncapped pen. I gave her the same answer. She received it both times with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes and a graciousness that had, beneath it, the faint tension of someone recalculating. I did not sign either document. I told Carol in late October, sitting at her kitchen table on a Sunday afternoon when the light was low and the neighborhood was quiet, and I had been carrying the information alone for long enough that the weight of it had begun to feel physical. I had not planned to tell her that day. I had driven over for the ostensible reason of returning a casserole dish I had borrowed 2 months earlier, which had been sitting in my cabinet waiting for an excuse. But Carol had poured 2 cups of coffee without asking, she always knew, and sat down across from me with the particular attentiveness of someone who has been watching their friend not quite be fine for some time and has been waiting, with patience and without pressure, for the moment when the friend was ready to stop pretending. I told her everything. Not just the documents and the figures and the legal machinery that Arthur and Rebecca were building quietly in the background, but the other part, the part that was harder to say out loud, the part about sitting at those dinner tables, the part about watching someone who had taken something irreplaceable from the life Edward and I had built together and having to smile and pass the bread and ask how the consulting work was going. Carol listened the way she always listened, completely, without interrupting, without rushing toward reassurance before I was finished. When I was done, she refilled both cups and sat quietly for a moment. Then she asked how I was holding up. I told her I was fine. She looked at me over the rim of her cup with 31 years of friendship in her eyes and said nothing at all. She knew I was lying. That was what 30 years of friendship looked like. It was the sound of Sylvia's voice that woke me. Not loud. She was never loud. Not in the way that called attention to itself. It was the particular quality of her voice when she was focused on something, a lower register than her social tone, the one she used when she was working rather than performing. I had learned to recognize the difference. That night, I recognized it through the wall of the guest room, where I had been sleeping lightly, the way I always slept when something was unresolved. I lay still for a moment, orienting myself. The clock on the nightstand read 12 minutes past 11. The house was otherwise quiet, no television, no music, just the low murmur of a conversation happening somewhere down the hall, in the direction of the kitchen. I got up carefully, the way you learn to move at night after decades of hospital shifts, no lights, no unnecessary sounds, weight distributed evenly so the floorboards don't announce you. I moved to the doorway of the guest room and stood there, listening. Daniel's voice joined Sylvia's. They were not arguing. They were planning. I could not hear every word. The distance and the walls between us took care of that. But I heard enough. That is the thing about listening carefully. You do not always need the complete sentence to understand what is being said. 35 years of reading patients, families, and situations had given me an ear for the shape of a conversation even when the details were obscured. What I heard, assembled from fragments over the next several minutes, was this. A man named Marcus Webb, a name I did not recognize, which Arthur would later tell me was a real estate agent with a firm that specialized in estate property sales, was expected at the house the following morning. The appointment was early. The paperwork, from what I gathered, was largely in order. Sylvia had been managing the process, and her tone as she described it carried the quiet satisfaction of someone approaching the completion of a long project. There was a listing agreement. There had apparently been preliminary conversations with at least one interested party. The figure mentioned, and I heard this number clearly, because Sylvia's voice rose slightly when she said it, the way people's voices do when they are speaking about something that pleases them, was considerably more than I had paid for the house in 1985, and considerably more than I had ever thought about it in purely financial terms. I stood in the dark hallway and listened to my son and his wife discuss the sale of my home with the matter-of-fact efficiency of people who had already decided the outcome and were now simply managing the logistics. And then I heard Daniel say something that I have thought about many times since. His voice was quieter than Sylvia's. It always was when they talked like this, as though some part of him understood, on a level below conscious reasoning, that he was operating outside something he couldn't quite name. What he said was, "She's not going to just go along with this." There was a brief pause. Sylvia said, "She won't need to. She'll already be gone." I went back to the guest room and sat on the edge of the bed in the dark. So that was it. That was the reason for the conversation earlier in the evening, the one Daniel had initiated over dinner, with the rehearsed gentleness of someone delivering a prepared message about how I might be more comfortable somewhere designed for people in my situation. It had not been a suggestion made out of concern. It had been a logistical requirement. Marcus Webb was arriving in the morning. The house needed to be accessible, manageable, free of the complication of an occupant who might ask questions or refuse to cooperate, or worse, from their perspective, call a lawyer. She needed me out of the house before the appointment. I sat with that understanding for a moment, not with anger, not yet, but with the particular clarity that comes when the last piece of a puzzle finds its place and the full image becomes visible for the first time. Then I picked up my phone and called Arthur. He answered on the third ring, his voice carrying the slightly thickened quality of someone pulled from the edge of sleep but alert almost immediately. I told him what I had heard. I kept it brief: dates, names, the approximate substance of the conversation. Arthur listened without interrupting, the way he always did. When I finished, there was a short silence. "Marcus Webb," he said, as though confirming something to himself. "I know that firm." Another pause. "Helen, if she's filed a listing agreement without your authorization on a property that belongs to you under the second will, that changes our timeline." I asked him what that meant practically. "It means we move tomorrow," he said. "I'll have everything ready by morning. Rebecca is already prepared. We've been building toward this for months. I just need you to do one thing tonight." I asked him what. "Get some rest," he said, "and let me handle the morning." I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, but because it was so entirely characteristic of Arthur: practical, steady, focused on the next necessary step rather than the weight of the current one. Edward had loved that about him. I had always loved it too. I told him I would try. After I set the phone down, I sat in the dark guest room for a while longer, listening to the house settle around me, the sounds of a structure that had stood for 40 years, and that Edward had chosen for its good bones and its capacity to last. Somewhere down the hall, the murmur of voices had gone quiet. The house was still. I thought about what the morning would bring. I thought about Arthur's voice, steady and ready, the same as it had been for 30 years. I thought about the second will sitting in the safe in his office, waiting for exactly this. She needed me gone before morning. She just didn't know I wasn't going far. I woke at 5:17 without an alarm. That had always been my way, the body trained over decades of early hospital shifts to surface at whatever hour it was needed, without prompting. There was no disorientation this time, no moment of not knowing where I was. I knew exactly where I was. I knew exactly what day it was. And I knew, with the particular clarity that sometimes comes after a night of light and watchful sleep, precisely what I intended to do with it. Carol's guest room was still dark. The neighborhood outside was quiet in the way that only exists in the hour before the world remembers itself. No cars, no voices, just the distant sound of a mockingbird working through its repertoire in the oak tree at the end of the street. I lay still for a moment and listened to it. There was something clarifying about that sound. Something that had nothing to do with deeds or documents or any of the machinery of the day ahead, and everything to do with the fact that the world continued being itself regardless. Then I got up, folded the blanket at the foot of the bed, and went to wash my face. My phone was on the nightstand, and when I picked it up, Arthur's message was already there, sent at 5:04, which told me he had been awake well before I had. "Everything is in place. Rebecca confirmed last night. I'll be at the house by 8:30. You come after 9. Give me time to get set up." I read it twice. Then I set the phone down and finished getting dressed. I had brought very little with me when I left the house 2 nights ago. Whoever had packed that bag had not packed it with any expectation of a long stay, and they had not been wrong about the timeline, just wrong about the reason. I put on the clothes I had worn the day before, which were clean enough, and the same cardigan, and my good shoes rather than the comfortable ones, because my mother had always said that the right shoes had a way of reminding you who you were when you needed reminding. I thought she had been right about that. I ran a comb through my hair, checked my reflection in the small mirror above the dresser, with the same brisk efficiency I had used before every shift at the hospital for 35 years. Not vanity, just the professional habit of presenting yourself as someone who has things under control, because half the time that presentation was what made it true, and went downstairs. Carol was already in the kitchen. She was standing at the stove in her robe with her back to me, and she turned when she heard me on the stairs with an expression that said she had not slept particularly well either. She had made oatmeal, which she set in front of me without comment, and poured 2 glasses of orange juice and sat down across the table with her hands wrapped around her own glass, in the way she always sat when she was thinking carefully about what to say. I ate. The oatmeal was good steel cut, the way she always made it, with a little brown sugar and something I couldn't quite identify that turned out to be a pinch of cinnamon. Small details matter on mornings like that one. They keep you in your body when your mind would prefer to run ahead of itself. Carol watched me for a moment. "Arthur called me last night," she said, "after you called him." I looked up. "He didn't tell me details," she added quickly. "Just that things were moving today and that you'd explain when you were ready." She paused. "He wanted someone to know where you were." That was Arthur. Thorough in the way that mattered. I told her the general shape of what was happening, not the full legal architecture, not the specifics of what Rebecca had documented, but enough. The listing agreement. Marcus Webb. The plan for the morning. By the time I finished, Carol had set down her glass and was looking at me with an expression I recognized from 31 years of friendship, not alarm, not pity, but the particular attentiveness of someone taking in information they intend to hold carefully. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Are you sure about this?" It was, I thought, exactly the right question. Not "are you ready" or "are you okay" or any of the other things people ask when they are really asking something else. Just, "Are you sure?" Because certainty at that point was the only thing that mattered. I thought about the folder on Arthur's desk, the 4 fraudulent signatures, Rebecca's careful voice saying this is significant, the second will with Edward's handwriting on the last page. The 8 years Arthur had kept it safe in his office, waiting for a morning exactly like this one. "Yes," I said. Carol nodded once, the nod of someone who asked, because they needed to hear the answer, not because they doubted it. She stood up and took both our bowls to the sink, rinsed them with the unhurried practicality that was one of the things I had always loved most about her, and dried her hands on the dish towel hanging from the oven handle. I put on my coat, the same one I had taken from the rack by the door 2 nights ago, the last thing I had picked up before walking out of my own home. I buttoned it slowly, straightened the collar, picked up my bag. Carol walked me to the front door. The morning had come up while we were sitting at the table, pale gold light now across the porch, dew still on the grass, the mockingbird still going somewhere in the distance. Savannah in the early morning had always had this quality, a gentleness before the heat of the day set in, and I had always thought it was one of the most honest hours the city offered. Carol stood at the door with her hand on the frame. "Call me when it's done," she said. I looked at her 31 years of friendship, of showing up, of knowing when to ask and when to stay quiet and when to simply make oatmeal and sit across the table while someone found their footing. She'd hear about it either way, I said. I parked 2 houses down, the way Arthur had suggested. Not to be dramatic about it, Arthur was not a dramatic man and neither was I, but because arriving at the right moment mattered, and the right moment was not first. The right moment was after. After Marcus Webb had come in and set his briefcase down and spread his documents across whatever surface Sylvia had cleared for the occasion, after Daniel had picked up a pen, after the machinery of the morning was already in motion and the people running it believed, completely and without reservation, that everything was going according to plan. That was the moment for the door to open. I sat in the car and watched the house from a distance. A dark sedan I didn't recognize was parked in the driveway, newer model. Clean, the kind of vehicle a professional drives to appointments where presentation matters. The curtains in the front room were drawn back slightly, the way they were when someone inside wanted light without visibility. A perfectly ordinary Tuesday morning on Hargrove Street to anyone passing by. My phone showed 8:53. Arthur had gone in 7 minutes ago. I got out of the car. The front walk was 22 steps from the curb to the porch. I had walked it so many times over 40 years that I knew the number without counting. The third flagstone from the left still had the small crack Edward had always meant to repair and never gotten to, and the rosebush along the left side of the path had come back this spring fuller than it had been in years. I notice these things the way you notice the details of a place that belongs to you, that has always belonged to you, that you are walking back into, not as a visitor but as the person whose name is on the document that says so. I went up the porch steps and opened the front door. The scene inside had the quality of a photograph caught just before something moves. Marcus Webb, a man in his mid-40s in a well-pressed suit, with the practiced ease of someone who spent his days facilitating transactions between people and their properties, was standing near the dining room table, which had been cleared and set with a neat arrangement of documents in labeled folders. He had the particular posture of a professional in the middle of a presentation, slightly forward, attentive, pen in hand. Daniel was seated at the table. He had a document in front of him and was holding a pen in a way that suggested he had been about to sign something approximately 30 seconds before the door opened. He looked up when I came in, and the expression that moved across his face was complicated surprise first, then something harder to name, something that had guilt in it and something that might have been, underneath everything else, a fragment of relief. Sylvia was standing to Marcus Webb's left, positioned in the way she always positioned herself, present without appearing to direct, involved without appearing to control. She was dressed for the occasion in a manner that managed to suggest both professional competence and personal ease. She had clearly prepared for this morning with some care. She had not prepared for me. I watched the moment she registered my presence. It happened in stages: the initial glance toward the door, the automatic social processing of an unexpected arrival, and then the full recognition, arriving a half-second behind, that reconfigured everything else on her face in real time. "Helen," she said, just the one word. Her voice was steady. I gave her credit for that. "Good morning," I said. I stepped inside and let the door stay open behind me. Marcus Webb had turned from the table with the polished attentiveness of a man accustomed to adapting quickly to unexpected developments in rooms where a great deal of money was involved. He looked at me with professional pleasantness and slightly recalibrated eyes. "I don't believe we've met," he said, extending a hand. "Marcus Webb, with Coastal Property Group. And you are—" "The owner of the property," I said. I shook his hand. The room was very quiet for a moment. Sylvia began to say something. I could see the sentence forming, the pivot already being constructed, the reasonable explanation being assembled from available parts. She was fast. She had always been fast. But she did not get the first word out before the door behind me opened the rest of the way, and Arthur Pendleton walked in. Arthur had the unhurried authority of a man who had spent 40 years being the steadiest person in difficult rooms. He was carrying a leather portfolio, the serious one, the flat rectangular kind that suggested its contents were both substantial and organized, and he was dressed in the dark suit he reserved for occasions that required him to be taken seriously on sight. He nodded to me as he came in, a small and sufficient acknowledgement, and then he looked at the room. His gaze moved from Marcus Webb to the documents on the table to Daniel to Sylvia, in that order, and settled. "Mr. Webb," Arthur said, setting his portfolio on the side table near the door with the calm deliberateness of someone who intended to be there for a while. "I'm Arthur Pendleton, attorney of record for the estate of Edward Marsh and legal counsel for Helen Marsh, the current owner of this property." He looked at the documents spread across the dining room table. "Before anything in this room is signed, there are several things you need to be made aware of." Marcus Webb looked at the documents. He looked at Arthur. He looked at Sylvia. Something in his posture shifted, not alarm, exactly, but the professional recalibration of a man who understood that the transaction he had arrived to complete was no longer the transaction he was in the middle of. He set his pen down on the table. I looked at Sylvia. She was looking at Arthur with the expression of someone doing very rapid calculations, assessing the portfolio, the suit, the language Arthur had used, the specific phrase "attorney of record," the presence of a woman she had arranged to have removed from the premises the night before, now standing in the middle of those premises with all the unhurried composure of someone who had never left. Something shifted in Sylvia's expression. Not quite fear, something colder than that. Arthur did not rush. That was entirely deliberate. He moved to the dining room table with the unhurried authority of someone who had all the time in the world, the precise opposite of how Sylvia moved through rooms, and I suspected he knew that. He unzipped his portfolio, removed documents in a specific sequence, and laid the first one on the table. Marcus Webb was standing to one side, pen in his breast pocket, watching with the careful attention of a professional who understood that whatever happened next would determine whether his morning continued or concluded. Sylvia had repositioned herself near the head of the table. Her posture had undergone a subtle adjustment, less open, more contained, the stance of someone who had stopped performing ease and started managing a situation. Daniel had not moved. He was still in his chair, the unsigned document in front of him, his pen set down at some point in the last 2 minutes. "What I'm presenting," Arthur said, addressing the room, "is a legal instrument executed by Edward Marsh approximately 3 weeks prior to his passing, in the presence of 2 witnesses and a licensed notary public, in full compliance with Georgia estate law." He looked at Marcus Webb. "It supersedes all previously existing testamentary documents and establishes sole and complete ownership of this property in the name of Helen Marsh." He slid the document toward Marcus Webb, who picked it up and began reading with focused professional attention. The room was quiet except for the sound of pages turning. Daniel leaned forward to read over Marcus Webb's shoulder. I watched his eyes move across the page slowly at first, then faster, then stopping. "When did Dad," he stopped. "Started again. 3 weeks before he passed?" "He came to my office," Arthur said. "We spent the better part of an afternoon on it. He was very clear about what he wanted." Daniel looked at me. Not with anger I had prepared for anger, but it wasn't that. It was the expression of a man encountering a version of events he hadn't known existed, reassembling 8 years of understanding in real time. I held his gaze and said nothing. There would be time for conversation later. Sylvia straightened. "This can be contested," she said. Her voice was controlled and precise, an impressively composed response for someone caught entirely off guard. "A document executed without the knowledge of primary beneficiaries, under potential undue influence, any probate court would examine the circumstances carefully." Arthur looked at her with an expression that was not unkind and not particularly concerned. "You're welcome to try," he said, and opened the second folder. He placed the notarization certificate on the table official stamp, licensed Georgia notary, dated the same week as the will. Beside it, the witness attestation form with 2 signatures printed clearly beneath. "The notary is still in practice in Atlanta," Arthur said. "One witness is a retired judge. The other is a law professor at a local university. Both have provided written confirmation of the signing and Edward's state of mind." He set 2 additional letters beside the certificates. "I have those here as well." Marcus Webb examined the notarization seal carefully, then set it down. "Mr. Pendleton," he said, "I was engaged to facilitate a transaction involving this property. If ownership is established under a superseding legal instrument I wasn't made aware of," he stopped, "I need to step back from this transaction pending clarification." "That's the appropriate response," Arthur said. Sylvia turned to Daniel with focused urgency. "Daniel, we need to address this with our own attorney before—" "The document is legitimate, Sylvia." Daniel said it quietly, without heat. The way a man states something he has arrived at by looking at it directly and accepting what he sees. His voice had a quality I hadn't heard from him in 2 years, not the careful, rehearsed tone of recent visits, but something older, something I recognized from before all of this began. Sylvia looked at him. He did not look back at her. Marcus Webb aligned his folders into a neat stack, the action of a man preparing to leave. Arthur returned his documents to the portfolio in the same deliberate order he had removed them, which was the action of someone who had finished presenting his case and was simply waiting for the room to arrive at the conclusion the evidence required. I stood near the doorway and watched all of this, and felt something I could not quite name, not triumph, because it was not that kind of morning, something quieter and more solid. The particular feeling of a thing being set right after a long time of being wrong. The second will was on the table. Marcus Webb had stepped back, and Daniel, my son, the boy I had raised in this house, in these rooms, had looked at the truth and called it by its name. "You're welcome to try," Arthur had said, and opened the second folder. The second folder contained something different from the first. Where the will had been a matter of estate law, technical, procedural, the kind of thing that could theoretically be argued in a courtroom over months, what Arthur removed from the second folder belonged to a different category entirely. I watched Sylvia's eyes track the document as Arthur placed it on the table, and I saw the moment she recognized what it was. The recognition was small and involuntary, a single blink that lasted a fraction of a second longer than normal, and then her face was composed again. But I had been watching her for 3 years. I did not miss it. "This," Arthur said, "is a forensic document examination report prepared by a certified examiner with 17 years of experience in question document analysis." He turned it so the room could see the cover page, the examiner's credentials, the case reference number, the date. It concerns 4 financial authorization documents bearing a signature identified as Edward Marsh's, all executed after the date of his passing. The room had gone completely still. Marcus Webb, who had been preparing to leave, had stopped moving entirely. He was standing near the door with his folders under his arm, and he was listening. Daniel had looked up from the table. Arthur walked through the report methodically, the way he did everything without drama, without emphasis beyond what the facts themselves provided. Because the facts themselves provided enough. The first document, a transfer authorization dated 14 months after Edward's death, directing funds from a secondary investment account into an external account. Signature on the authorization line confirmed fraudulent by the examiner, with a confidence rating described in the report as highly conclusive. The second, a beneficiary designation change on a separate account, executed 6 months after the first transfer, again bearing a signature the examiner had determined could not have been produced by the same hand that signed the authenticated samples collected from documents Edward had signed during his lifetime. The third and fourth followed the same pattern, different accounts, different dates, the same conclusion on each. The examiner's findings on all 4 documents are consistent, Arthur said, returning the report to the table. The signatures are not genuine. The word genuine landed in the room with a particular weight. Sylvia said, handwriting analysis is not an exact science. Any competent attorney could challenge. Mrs. Marsh. The voice came from the doorway to the front hall. Rebecca Cho, the financial fraud investigator, who had spent the past 10 months building the second layer of what Arthur had begun, walked into the dining room with a case file under one arm and the composed precision of someone who had testified in federal proceedings and found this particular room considerably less intimidating than those. Arthur had clearly arranged her entrance to follow the forensic report, and the timing was deliberate, one layer of evidence confirmed before the next was introduced. I've been asked to present the financial analysis that accompanies the document examination, she said, setting her file on the table beside Arthur's materials and opening it without preamble. What I'm about to walk you through is a complete transaction record for the 4 transfers referenced in the forensic report. She turned to the first page of her analysis, a clean, clearly formatted chart showing account numbers, transfer dates, amounts, and destination accounts, the kind of document designed to be read quickly and understood completely. The total across all 4 transactions, she said, is more than $300,000. She indicated the destination column on the chart. All 4 transfers were directed to the same receiving account. She placed a second page on the table beside the first. It was a copy of the account registration for the destination account name, address, account number, date of establishment. The name on the registration was Sylvia's. The silence that followed was the kind that has texture to it, not empty, but dense with the specific weight of information settling into understanding at different speeds for different people in the room. Marcus Webb made a quiet sound that was not quite a word and took one small step backward toward the door. Daniel had gone very still. He was looking at the account registration on the table, at the name printed on it in plain black type, and he had the expression of a man who has been standing on what he believed was solid ground and has just felt it shift beneath his feet in a way that cannot be explained away or reframed or absorbed into any version of events that still makes sense. Sylvia began to speak. These transactions have a legitimate explanation, she said. Her voice was still controlled, but it had lost the quality of someone mounting an argument and taken on the quality of someone buying time. There was an arrangement, a financial understanding between Daniel and me regarding estate management that— Is that arrangement documented? Rebecca asked. A pause. It was an informal? Is there written correspondence, any form of recorded agreement between you and Mr. Marsh, or between you and the estate, authorizing these transfers? The pause this time was longer. Sylvia said nothing. Rebecca turned back to her file with the brisk efficiency of someone closing a section of testimony and began setting out the final supporting documents, the bank statements showing the transfers cleared, the timeline overlaid against the dates of the fraudulent signatures, the complete paper trail assembled over 10 months into something that required no interpretation and allowed for very little argument. I looked at my son. He had not moved. He was still looking at the account registration at that name, in that plain black type, and the expression on his face had settled into something I had not seen there before. Not confusion, Not the complicated guilt of someone caught between two loyalties. Something simpler and harder than either of those. The expression of a man at the end of a long process of understanding, arriving finally at the thing he had been, on some level, avoiding. He turned slowly to look at his wife. I had spent 41 years watching my son's face through childhood and adolescence, and the long, complicated passage into adulthood, through grief and achievement, and every ordinary moment in between. I knew every register of his expression, the way you know the rooms of a house you have lived in for decades, by feel as much as by sight. I had never seen him look at anyone the way he looked at Sylvia in that moment. I hope I never do again. No one spoke for a moment after Rebecca finished. The documents were on the table, the facts were in the room, nothing left to present, nothing left to interpret. The silence stretched longer than silences usually do. Sylvia broke it. She looked at me, not at Daniel, not at Arthur, at me. You did this. Her voice had shed its careful calibration. What remained was harder and less managed. Someone who has watched something she built come apart and needs to assign the destruction to someone else. You went behind your own son's back. You went to lawyers and investigators and built a case against your own family. That's enough. Daniel's voice was not loud. It had the quality of a pronouncement rather than a reaction, something decided, not provoked. He was still sitting at the table, and the words landed with a weight that stopped Sylvia mid-sentence as completely as if he had crossed the room. She turned to look at him. He looked back. Whatever she saw caused her to close her mouth. The quiet that followed had a different texture, not the silence of things ending, but of things being decided. Daniel stood up slowly, both hands resting on the table surface for a moment. Then he straightened and faced Sylvia. I need you to leave, he said. 3 years of marriage, 3 years of adjusted habits and a version of himself that had gradually become less recognizable. He said it the way you say something when the decision is already made and the words are only the formality required to make it official. Sylvia looked at him for a long moment. Something moved across her face unguarded. For once, and she looked, for the first time since I had known her, like someone who had run out of moves. She picked up her bag, she looked at Daniel one more time, then she walked to the front door and went through it, and it swung shut behind her. The whole thing took less than a minute. Marcus Webb cleared his throat. Mr. Marsh, he said carefully, given what's come to light this morning, I'll be formally withdrawing from this transaction. Written confirmation will follow from our office today. He looked briefly at Arthur, who nodded, then picked up his folders, buttoned his jacket, and showed himself out. Arthur touched my arm briefly. I'll be in touch later this week. Then, to Daniel. Son, you know where I am. He said it the way a man speaks to someone he has known since childhood, and then he and Rebecca gathered their things and left. The front door closed. Just the two of us. Daniel stood in the middle of the dining room, looking at the table where the documents had been. The cleared surface still held the particular quality of a space where something significant had recently occurred. He turned to face me. I had thought about this moment during the long months of waiting. I had prepared, in the quiet way I prepared for difficult things, for several possible versions of it. What I had not prepared for was how young he would look. Not inexperienced, he was 41 and had just done something requiring real courage. Young the way grief makes people young, stripping away the composure of adulthood and leaving something more undefended underneath. He looked the way he had at 17, standing in a hospital corridor trying very hard to be steady and not quite managing it. Mom, he said. One word. The same word he had used the night before, in this same room with an entirely different meaning. I crossed the room and put my arms around my son. He stood still for a moment, the stillness of someone who hasn't been held by their mother in a long time and has forgotten how to receive it. Then something gave way, quietly, the way things give way when they've been held too tightly for too long. I said nothing. There was nothing that needed saying yet. After a while, I stepped back and looked at him. He wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, something he had done since he was 7 years old, and almost smiled. I'm sorry, he said. Mom, I'm sorry. I know, I said. And I meant it. He walked to the head of the table and sat down in the chair at the end. Edward's chair, the one with the slightly higher back that his father had claimed on the first night we moved in, and never relinquished. Not deliberately, I thought. Just because it was the closest chair. Because he was tired. Because sometimes the body finds its way to the things it remembers. I sat in the chair beside him, the one that had always been mine. The door had closed behind Sylvia. Daniel sat in his father's chair. Neither of us spoke for a long time. Arthur came back at 2:30. He had said later in the week, but when I opened the door and found him on the porch with his portfolio in hand, I understood from his expression that there was something he hadn't been ready to give me that morning. Something requiring the other business to be concluded first. He reached into the portfolio and removed a single envelope, the personal size, the kind from a stationery box rather than an office supply store. My name was on the front in Edward's handwriting. Beneath it, in smaller letters, "When the time is right." He gave it to me the same afternoon he signed the will, Arthur said, separately from the legal documents. He was very specific when the time was right. A pause. I think today qualifies. I took the envelope. Daniel appeared in the kitchen doorway when he heard Arthur's voice, "Coffee forgotten." He looked at the envelope the way he had looked at the will that morning, adjusting to the existence of something he hadn't known was there. Arthur excused himself quietly and let himself out. I looked at Daniel. "Come sit with me," I said. We went to the front room, not the dining room where the morning had happened, but the room with the old sofa and the afternoon light coming low through the west-facing windows. Daniel sat at one end. I sat at the other. I turned the envelope over once, looking at Edward's handwriting, then opened it. 2 pages, handwritten on cream stationery from the desk drawer where Edward had kept it for as long as I could remember. His careful, slightly architectural print, the hand of a man who had spent his career reading blueprints and valued legibility above everything. Daniel nodded, very slightly. I began to read. "Helen, I have asked Arthur to hold this until it is needed, which means that if you are reading it, the thing I prepared for has come to pass. I am sorry for that. I had hoped it wouldn't. I want to say something about Daniel, because I think it matters that you both understand what I observed. I did not write the second will because I had lost faith in our son. I wrote it because I had not. Daniel is, at his core, the person we raised him to be: careful, principled, and genuinely good. What I observed was not a failure of his character, but a vulnerability in it. He loves completely. That is not a flaw. It is the thing about him I am most proud of. But loving completely can make a person susceptible to someone who understands how to use that love as a point of entry. And I recognized what I was seeing before I had the words for it. I did not tell him because telling him would have required him to choose between his father's suspicion and his own heart. That seemed cruel, and I was not certain I was right. But I was certain enough to prepare. The house, and everything connected to it, belongs to you. It always did. I am only making that formal. But what I most want you both to know is this. The house was never what mattered. What mattered was the life we built in it. What mattered was the boy who grew up inside those walls and became the man sitting next to you now. That is the thing I built that I am most proud of. That is the thing no document can touch. Take care of each other. That was always the whole point. Edward. I folded the letter along its original creases and held it in my lap. The afternoon light moved across the floor slowly, without hurry the way time moves in a house that has known the same family for a long time. Daniel had not moved. He was looking at the middle distance with the stillness of someone absorbing something too large to process quickly. His jaw set in the way it always was when he was working very hard not to let his face do what it wanted to do. He did not quite manage it. I did not look away and did not say anything, because there are moments when the kindest thing you can do is simply be present while someone feels what they need to feel, without commentary and without the pressure of being watched by someone who needs them to be all right. He pressed the back of his hand briefly against his eyes. Then he stopped trying to hold it together, and he didn't. And I sat beside him and let him have the grief that had apparently been waiting 8 years for exactly this moment. It didn't last long. It didn't need to. When it passed, he looked at the letter in my hands. He knew all of it, Daniel said, barely above a whisper. He knew enough, I said, and he chose to protect you instead of confront you. That was his decision. Daniel was quiet for a moment, looking at the street outside the oak tree at the corner, larger now but unmistakably the same tree he had climbed as a boy. I didn't deserve that, he said. You didn't have to, I said. That's the whole point of it. Another silence. Then, quietly, he loved you more than I ever understood. I took his hand. He loved you more than you knew, I said. That's what fathers do. The azaleas came back first. Edward had planted them along the front walk in our second year here, choosing the variety himself with the deliberate care he applied to everything, consulting a horticulture guide, asking questions at the nursery until he understood what he was putting in the ground and why. Every spring for 40 years, they had come back without fail. I was on my knees in the side garden on a Saturday morning in early April, working the soil along the back fence where Edward had kept his cutting garden dahlias and black-eyed Susans and the coneflowers he liked because they returned reliably without much intervention, which he had always considered an admirable quality in a plant. The bed had gone wild over the winter, and I was working through it methodically, clearing and loosening and making room. It was good work, the kind that asks something of the body and gives the mind space to settle. Daniel arrived mid-morning with a can of white paint and a brush set still tagged from the store. He didn't announce his intentions, just went around to the back fence, the one his father had built from cedar posts the summer Daniel turned 12, the one that had needed repainting for 2 years, and began. I could hear him from the garden, the steady back and forth of a brush on wood, unhurried, covering ground one section at a time. We didn't talk much. We didn't need to. There are forms of repair that happen in parallel, each person attending to their own section of what needs doing, the presence of the other person itself, a kind of conversation. Daniel needed to be useful in a concrete way, to contribute something physical and visible to the place he had nearly helped to lose. The best thing I could do was let him. By mid-morning, the fence was white again for the first time in years. The cutting garden was cleared and ready, and the air smelled of fresh paint and turned earth and the sweetness of April in coastal Georgia. Carol arrived just before noon with a peach pie homemade, still faintly warm, in the ceramic dish she reserved for occasions significant enough to warrant the good bakeware. She surveyed the garden, the freshly painted fence, and me at the porch steps with dirt on my gloves, and nodded once with the satisfaction of someone whose assessment has been confirmed. "You look better," she said. "I feel better," I said. She handed me the pie and said, "Edward would have approved of the fence." "He'd have said Daniel missed a spot on the second rail," I said. Carol smiled. "He absolutely would have." Daniel came around from the back with paint on his forearm and the slightly sheepish expression of a man who has just been informed he missed a spot and has gone back to fix it. The three of us sat on the porch with the azaleas going full and bright along the front walk, and the conversation was easy and ordinary, the kind that requires nothing except presence, which is exactly what the best conversations require. The letter from the hospital had arrived the previous week. It was from the director of nursing at Savannah Memorial, a woman who had been a floor nurse during my last years there, and had since risen to run the department with the competence of someone who had actually done the work. She was writing to ask whether I might consider joining the hospital's patient advocacy program as a volunteer consultant, working with long-term patients and their families on care navigation, the kind of support that required not medical expertise but the particular wisdom of someone who understood the system from the inside. I had let it sit on the kitchen counter for a few days while I thought. It was not a complicated decision. It was, in fact, the easiest decision I had made in some time. 35 years of that work in an official capacity had taught me what I valued most about it, not the title or the structure, but the simple act of being present for people who were frightened and needed someone who understood what they were facing. Doing it on my own terms, for those reasons alone, felt less like a new chapter and more like a return to something essential. I wrote back that evening and said yes. When I told Daniel, he was quiet for a moment and then said, "That sounds exactly right, Mom." His voice had the quality it used to have present, genuine, unguarded, the voice I had known for 41 years, without the careful distance of the past 2 between us. I told him it did feel exactly right. After Carol left and Daniel packed up his paint and said goodbye with the easy naturalness of someone who intended to come back, I stayed outside a little longer in the late afternoon quiet. The cutting garden was ready for planting. The fence was white. The azaleas were at their peak, always exactly 2 weeks before the heat came and the blooms fell, and I stood at the edge of the yard and looked at the street and the neighborhood going about its ordinary Saturday around me. I thought about Edward choosing plants from a horticulture guide. I thought about him building this fence with a 12-year-old Daniel, the two of them sunburned and arguing pleasantly about the correct way to set a post. I thought about everything that had happened in this yard over 40 years, and then I stopped thinking about the past and looked at what was here. The garden was coming back. So was everything else. There is a particular hour in Savannah when the day doesn't so much end as relent. The heat steps back. The light goes from white to gold to something softer, and the neighborhood sounds change daytime traffic, giving way to porch conversations and the distant laughter of children being called in for supper. It is the hour I have always loved most about this city, and on an evening in late April, several weeks after everything that had happened, I was sitting in the old rocking chair on the front veranda watching it happen. I had a cup of tea. The cutting garden was planted now, seedlings in, the first pale suggestions of green already showing along the back fence. The veranda boards were warm under my feet, and the street below was doing exactly what it had always done at this hour, being itself, without any awareness of what had recently occurred in the house behind me. I have always found that reassuring. The world's reliable continuation. I was thinking about Edward, not with grief or urgency, the way I had during the hard months. This was something quieter, the ordinary thinking about, someone that happens when you have loved them long enough that their absence becomes a presence of a different kind. He was in the veranda boards he had replaced in the summer of 1998. He was in the shape of the garden along the back fence. He was in Daniel's hands, which had always looked like his father's, and in the way Daniel set a paintbrush down handle side up exactly the way Edward had always done it. He was in the letter folded in the drawer of my bedside table, which I had read twice more since that afternoon on the sofa and would read again at intervals for the rest of my life. He was not gone in any way that was absolute. He had simply changed form. I thought about what he had written. The house was never what mattered. I had been turning that line over for weeks, and I had arrived, slowly, at what I believed it meant. What we leave behind is never the things we leave behind. Not the house, not the accounts, not the documents in a lawyer's safe, though those things matter and their presence has real consequences. Those are the vessels. What actually travels across the distance between a life and the lives it touches is something that cannot be filed or transferred or contested in any court. It is the quality of attention a person brought to the people they loved. The choices made in private, without audience, that reflect what someone actually valued when no one was watching. Edward had made those choices his whole life. He had made one final one in a lawyer's office, 3 weeks before he left, for a woman and a son he trusted completely, even when trust required preparing for its possible failure. That is what God asks of us, I think. Not perfection, not certainty. Just the willingness to love people carefully enough to protect them, even when you're not sure you've gotten everything right. The evening deepened around the veranda. I thought about the long months of waiting the dinners with a steady face, the documents I refused to sign, the weight of knowing something I could not yet act on. I had not been certain, through any of it, that things would resolve the way they did. I had only been certain of what Edward had left me, and of Arthur, and of the slow and careful work of doing things right rather than doing them fast. God gives us the people we need, I thought. Sometimes for longer than we expect, and sometimes not as long as we want, and the work of a life is learning to be grateful for both. The street below was quieting now, the last light catching the upper branches of the oak at the corner. I rocked slowly in the chair that had been Edward's originally, ceded to me somewhere in the years after and never reclaimed, and I let the evening do what evenings in this city do, settle everything down into something manageable and real. Daniel was coming for dinner on Sunday. That had been re-established quietly, without ceremony, a phone call, a question, a yes. Not the careful rehearsed calls of the past 2 years, but the easy ones, the kind that wander and end only when there's nothing more to say. We had not talked through everything yet. We would, in time, but Sunday dinner was enough. It was, in fact, everything. The tea had gone cool. The first firefly of the evening appeared at the edge of the garden, a single pulse of light in the growing dark, and I thought, there it is. There it always is. The small, persistent proof that the world continues to offer something worth noticing, if you are willing to sit still long enough to see it. If you have stayed with me through this story, I am grateful. It is not a comfortable story. It does not end with everything restored and no remainder of pain unaccounted for. What it ends with is this: a woman on a veranda in the evening, a garden coming back, a son coming to dinner on Sunday, and the enduring evidence of a love that thought ahead. Some of you watching know exactly what I mean. Some of you are carrying something right now that you haven't yet found the words for. Some of you are wondering whether the people you love are as protected as they believe themselves to be. I can only tell you what I know, that love, when it is real, prepares, and that the people who loved us well tend to leave us with more than we realize until the day we need it. Where are you watching from tonight? Tell me in the comments. I have found that knowing who is out there makes the evening feel less quiet in the best possible way. Edward didn't just leave me a house. He left me proof that love, when it's real, finds a way to protect what matters most, even long after the one who loved you is gone.